So the moment you found out that a priest was about to be charged,
Yeah, I was working at the Blade covering religion, and I was sitting in my cubicle, and Chris Hall came up, and she was the police reporter, and she asked me if I knew anything about a Father Gerald Robinson. And I said, well, I just barely knew him. I mean, I knew his name. I knew he served the Polish Catholic churches, and not much more than that. I said, why do you ask? And she goes, well, I think he's about to be arrested. I said, arrested for what? And she goes, murder. And I said, murder? I almost fell out of my chair because, I mean, at the time there was a lot of, the Catholic Church was in the news for all the, clerical abuse cases and allegations and things. So there was a lot going on with the Catholic Church, but, murder was a real shock.
yeah, I think Rich Kurger said that he's like the only priest ever killed or accused of killing a nun. Is that true as far as you know?
Yes, I researched it as much as I could, and not in the United States. I think there was one in Italy, but the only case in the U.S. history of a priest arrested for and charged with the killing of a nun and then ultimately convicted.
So it's the only one in the United States.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
So, okay. So so you said you almost fell out of your seat. So what's the first, as a journalist, what's the first thing that you do once you get a tip?
Well, it's kind of strange, the way journalism is. Things are segmented, and so Chris Hall would cover the police beat. I'd cover religion, but at the time, the religion was becoming more and more newsy. Before I started covering religion in 2000, it was kind of the back page stuff about, what church is building a new sanctuary or whatever, what color carpet they were going to use. And then, all of a sudden you had the 9/11 in 2001, and, Islam was in front page news, and I was covering that. And then the clerical sexual abuse scandal rocked the Catholic Church in 2002. And so the lines were a little blurred. So Chris was handling the police part of it. But I went down to the police station the next day on Saturday and met with the detectives, and that's when things really kind of snowballed because Steve Forrester and Tom Ross were talking about it and said they believed that the nun was killed in a ritual killing. And so I wrote a story about that ran at the top of the Blade on Sunday, and on Monday I started getting calls from New York publishers saying, this case is so unusual, you need to write a book about it. So I really wasn't too keen on writing a book about such a kind of a sad story, but I ended up doing it, and so that's how I got involved, by just talking to the detectives.
Yeah. So talk about the Catholic Church in Toledo during that era. I mean, maybe not even going back to, and obviously this is before your time, but going back to 1980 when this all happened. And there's people who say, hey, the Catholic Church was trying to cover this up. So how powerful was the Catholic Church back in 1980?
Well, I talked to some policemen that worked in Toledo in 1980, and they said you could not arrest a priest. It was just impossible. If you tried to arrest a priest for anything, the police chief would go to the bishop, no charges would be filed, the bishop would take care of it, and the priest would be sent away or moved or whatever, but there was never any official charges. The Lucas County prosecutor, Tony Pisa, was a devout Catholic. The deputy police chief, Ray Vetter, was a devout Catholic who was looking at becoming a deacon in the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church had a lot of reach in a lot of areas in Toledo back in 1980, and priests were given special treatment.
So do you believe that they actually thought Father Robinson did this back in 1980, but the church protected him?
Yes, I really do believe that, because the detectives on the case said that within 10 days they had narrowed it down to one suspect. They started out with, dozens of them, and just because of the timing and locations of where everybody was and the type of crime it was, they just said that Robinson was their only suspect. But when they brought the evidence they had to the prosecutor's office, the prosecutor said there wasn't enough there to charge him. So the police detective, Art Marks in particular, was really frustrated because he said, we wanted to go arrest him and take it to court and let the court decide, but the prosecutor wouldn't even let it go that far.
When the prosecutor said we don't have enough evidence to charge him, is it your belief that they didn't charge him because he was a priest?
Yes. Yes, it wasn't unusual. There were other priests that were caught, molesting kids, and the police tried to arrest them, and the case was just shoved under the rug, and the priest was moved to another parish or something like that. There was numerous cases, and I think I have at least 10 that I've documented where police tried to arrest a priest. The police chief took the case to the bishop said, I'll handle it, and that's the end of it. You never heard anything more. One of the priests, Leo Welch, he was accused of abusing altar boys in Bellevue, Ohio, which is part of the Toledo diocese. And when the mother of one of the kids went to the pastor and complained, the priest was moved out of that parish, and then he ended up eventually leaving the Catholic Church, and a Blade reporter went up and interviewed him years later in the 2000s, and he admitted that he was sexually experimenting, but so they had all this evidence against this priest, but they just, covered it up.
Wow. So then talk about 2004 when ultimately he ends up getting indicted. How had the atmosphere changed to that point? Again, this was, in my mind, it seems to be like the reckoning of the Catholic Church. There were settlement, more documents coming out about abuse and cover-ups and stuff like that. So how had the atmosphere changed?
Yes, it changed dramatically after the clerical sexual abuse scandal erupted in Boston, and then spread across the country, where the movie Spotlight was about that, where the reporters dug into cases of sexual abuse allegations and found that the church had covered it up. And then every diocese in the country had similar situations, including Toledo. So, back in 1980, the priests were put on a pedestal, and they were treated. People didn't believe they could do anything wrong. In fact, one of the victims told me that he went and told his mom that he had been abused by a priest, and the mom slapped him and said, "Don't you ever talk about Father like that." So there was this, aura that the priest could do no wrong. But by 2004, with all the news about the Catholic Church and all the cases of abuse and cover-up, the whole climate had changed, and I don't think that what happened in 2004 could not have happened in 1980. So maybe the timing was just right for this case to come to light again.
Mm. And so let's talk about these secret archives. So Steve Forrester, when you read this affidavit for the warrant, he does seem frustrated. He said, "Look, we went. They gave us like 5 or 6 pieces a paper on Father Robinson. We know there's more than that. We know they have these secret archives. They're not cooperating," sort of thing. So talk about that and what this whole secret archive is.
Well, the Catholic Church is governed by canon law, which is its own set of rules and laws that they have to obey. And one of the canon laws, and I could look it up, but I don't know the number right offhand, states that they must keep sub-secreto files, which means below sub-secreto. It's below secret. It's like so secret that they can't even acknowledge them. So the Catholic Church is required by its own law to keep secret files that they can't even talk about, So when a policeman comes and asks, files a warrant, search warrant to get these files, the church would not even acknowledge that these files exist. They're bound by their own law to lie about it, or to at least not be truthful about it. So yeah, Steve Forrester and Tom Ross and a couple other police officers, detectives, filed a search warrant and went in there, and they got 2 pages, I think it was, just the basic data about Robinson. They came back with a no-knock search warrant and went into the files, and they were given another folder that was 148 pages on Robinson, and they believed that there were more, but that's all that they got.
So explain to people who may not completely understand, including me, but the first time they had a warrant and they said, hey, give us the files, they gave 5. So what's the difference between that and the no-knock search warrant?
Well, I'm not really sure about the legal difference, but I know that the second search warrant, they weren't, they just showed up with the warrant and said, we want to see the files now, And so Father Billion, who was in charge of the files, was not there. And so they waited a little bit, hoping that he'd come to the office, and the diocese office, and give them the files. But Tom Pletz, who was a lawyer, a very prominent lawyer in Toledo, represented the Toledo diocese. He said, I have a key. He came up, I have a key, and he opened up the file and came out and gave them the 148 pages. So, yeah.
And you know what was in those 148 pages?
Some of it was the church's internal investigations into the 1980 case when the nun was murdered. So they conducted their own investigation, and some of it had to do with the other allegations against priests, including Father Robinson.
Now, I think you had said that somebody said like some of the stuff in the secret files were like unbelievably bad. Can you talk about that at all?
Yes, Steve Forrester, who was one of the detectives that filed the search warrant, he said that that the contents were, quote, very bad, and he wouldn't tell me what was in it. And I said, well, can you give me a hint? And he really wouldn't do it. But another priest that I knew that was a good source and reliable for years, he told me that there were files in there about abortions paid for by the Toledo diocese to cover up priests.
Was this related to Father Robinson or just other priests in the diocese?
Well, yeah, the file from Robinson's case had to do with the murder investigation, and also some allegations or investigations of sexual abuse alleged against Robinson by some of the nuns and some of the other women in Toledo.
Do you know what their own internal investigation found, if they looked into that case?
No, I never did get access to those secret sub-secreto files, unfortunately.
So at what point, when you're covering this case, and it eventually goes to trial in 2006, I think April is when they started picking the jury. At what point were you like, wow, okay, this is going to be worldwide? I mean, I know you said publishers had reached out to you, but when did you realize how much attention this was going to get?
Well, when Robinson was, when he first went to court, there was a line of national television network trucks along the street parked in front of the courthouse. And I said, wow, this is really going to be big. And Court TV was there. They covered the trial from gavel to gavel. And so, I knew it was going to be big. And I mean, it was, like we said earlier, it was the only case of its kind in U.S. history. So, yeah, it was a pretty amazing case. And even now, I still kind of shake my head and find it almost hard to believe, but I know it's all true.
Yeah, that it actually happened in Toledo.
Yeah.
Um, but let's go back and talk, kind of about the investigation. What was the key piece of, so again, back in 1980, the prosecutor said, hey, we don't have enough to do this. So what was the tipping point in 2004 where they're like, yeah, he's our guy?
Well, one of the big pieces of evidence was an altar cloth that had been found in 1980, but the detectives just ended up looking at it and putting it in an evidence bag and not really looking at it that much. In 2004, when they reopened the case, a police detective looked at the altar cloth, Terry Cousineau. He looked at the altar cloth, and they said he had an artist's eye. He did sketches of suspects and things like that. And when he started looking at the altar cloth more carefully, he noticed that there were certain marks in the altar cloth that had been had been punctured. And so he ended up like matching the puncture marks in the altar cloth with the puncture marks, the stab wounds in Sister Margaret Ann's body. And so he started to think that this altar cloth had been used in the murder, that she had been covered with this altar cloth and then stabbed through the cloth. So that was part of it. And then the other part was the murder weapon, or what they believe was a murder weapon, which they found in Father Robinson's apartment at Mercy Hospital in 1980, but they never really did anything with it at the time. But in 2004, they started looking at it more closely, and the shape of the letter opener was really unusual. It's not just a flat blade, it had like 4 sides to it. As if you look at it straight on, it looks like a kite shape. And it matched the wounds in the nun's body, and it also, the puncture marks in the altar cloth were not a regular slit like a flat blade would have made, but they had a shape to it that matched that of the letter opener. So the combination of letter opener and the altar cloth, I think, were what caused them to.
I think in 2005 they actually exhumed Sister Paul's body, which is again another crazy twist in this case. I mean, what do you remember about that exhumation?
Yeah, yeah. They exhumed her body, took it to the Lucas County Coroner's office, and her body was well preserved, they said, and they could look at the stab wounds in her body, and they saw that it did appear to match the shape of the letter opener's blade. And then they removed a part of her jawbone where there was a puncture mark, and the jawbone, the mandible, is the strongest bone in the human body, according to the coroner's office. And the puncture mark in the bone in Sister Margaret Ann Paul's jaw matched the tip of the letter opener so perfectly. They had all these forensic experts on weapons and stab wounds to look at it, and they said it looked to fit so perfectly. It was like a key fitting into a lock. So.
Yeah, and sorry to jump around like this, but this whole investigation was reopened back in late 2003 because the Attorney General's office got a letter, and then they passed it on to, Forrester and Ross in the cold case. Again, obviously we're not using her name, but what can you tell us about that letter?
Well, that letter was really the whole key to the case being reopened, because what happened was the diocese had set up a review board to review cases of allegations of sexual abuse by priests. And they had done this in dioceses across the country because there was so much going on. They wanted to sort out, the review boards was entrusted with looking at these allegations and deciding whether there was any merit to it or not. So this nun in Toledo went before the review board, and she had this typed out testimony about her being abused when she was a kid, including like being put into a coffin and with cockroaches crawling all over her, her being sexually abused by priests and people in these weird robes and get-ups and things like that. And so her whole point was she wanted the diocese to pay half of her bills for psychological care and for medicines instead of her religious order having to pay 100% of it. She thought since the perpetrators were Catholic priests that the diocese should be responsible for some of the finances. Well, the diocese heard her testimony and they rejected it. The review board said they didn't believe it, except for one guy on the review board, Dr. Robert Cooley. So anyway, they wouldn't pay her bills. If they had paid her bills and agreed to do that, this never would have come to the surface. But because they rejected it, the nun went to the local chapter of SNAP, the Survivors Network of Those Abused by Priests, and they decided to take her case to the Ohio Attorney General because they didn't trust the Lucas County Prosecutor's Office to really pursue it. So they went to Bowling Green, met with the representative from the Ohio Attorney General's office, and he sent it back to the Lucas County Cold Case Squad and said, I want you to look into this. And so then at that point, Julia Bates, the prosecutor, said, let's check it out.
And what's interesting, when talking to the person who wrote the letter, she said, I didn't know whether Father Robinson had killed Sister Paul at all, but I knew some of the things that he did to me, that he could be violent enough to do that, right? I mean, so why does the cold case team seize on this letter and say, aha, that's the guy?
Yeah. Well, it's Tom Ross. Tom Ross was a detective for in Toledo who had retired and then joined the cold case squad. He had been on the force in 1980 when when the murder happened and initial investigation was conducted. He wasn't on the team of detectives that looked into it in 1980, but he remembers the talk around the office saying that there was only one suspect, and it was Father Gerald Robinson. And then when he saw the nun's written testimony that was presented to the review board, that was sent to him from the Ohio Attorney General's office, he saw Father Gerald Robinson's name as one of the alleged perpetrators, abusers of this nun when she was a kid. And he said, that's the guy that they were looking at in 1980. But they never charged him. So that was how those things became connected, and Robinson became a suspect in 2004 again.
It really is. I mean, when you look at the investigation into this, I mean, it really was a pretty remarkable job in how they pieced all this together. But let's talk about the trial a little bit, and I don't want to keep you here all day, but the trial a little bit. So some people I had talked to, like the juror I talked to, and I know who you had interviewed back in 2006, those two ladies that were jurors, and they said Father Robinson's demeanor, even Rich Kerger had kind of alluded to this, is that, he was a little man, he wasn't real emotional, he didn't react much, and, they complained that, well, he never looked at the jury, he looked kind of aloof and standoffish. So you were in the courtroom, I mean, what were you seeing?
Well, I was behind Father Robinson, and so I couldn't really see his face most of the time. But I saw him walk in and walk out, and talking to his attorneys, and I, catch glimpses of him. But from what everybody who could see him clearly said, he really looked disinterested. He looked kind of detached from the proceedings. Some people speculated that he was given some kind of sedative or drug to, that kind of zoned him out. And so he never really, it looked like he was almost going to fall asleep sometimes during some of the key testimony of the trial. So yeah, that's not enough in itself to convict a person, but it sure didn't help his case that he looked like he didn't really care what was going on around him.
Yeah. So as a journalist, what's this like covering this case, like day to day to day? Had to be a little surreal, I guess.
I retired from journalism in 2023 after almost 50 years, 48 years in journalism, and I've never seen a case like this. So, I was just always kind of amazed at what was going on. The fact that, the priest was arrested, the fact that the cold case squad and reopened the case, the fact that there was allegations of a satanic ritual killing, the fact that they brought a Catholic priest exorcist into the trial to testify about all the signs of a ritual killing. There was just so many things to it that it was like a never-ending story that just kept taking all kinds of twists and turns. Other suspects that people mentioned, and including the defense attorneys suggesting other people might have been the perpetrators. So it just kept snowballing, and it was the only story I've ever seen like that, and I've certainly never covered any story that was as complex and sensational and interesting as this one.
As a journalist, there's sometimes where I'm like, where in the heck is my next investigation going to come from? What am I going to worry about now or tell a story? So, that was something that was just a gift that just gave for about 2 years. Well, longer
Yes,
than
it's
that.
still going on. But, when the trial started, I remember before the trial, I tried to talk to all the detectives and the witnesses, and nobody would talk because they didn't want to, tilt the jury one way or the other. So I went into the trial like with an open mind, saying, "Okay, let's see what you got. What kind of evidence do we have here? Is he guilty? Is he innocent?" I really didn't know, So as the case kept going, I thought that the prosecution team, Dean Mandros and Chris Anderson, just did a terrific job of proving that Father Robinson was a killer. And by the end of the trial, I felt like, I was the 13th juror. I agreed with the jury that I really believed that they had the evidence to prove that he was guilty.
So if you were on the jury, you would have convicted him?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. And, we had briefly touched on this, but, the defense says, why would he keep the murder weapon? And so the murder weapon was taken by the police in, 1980? And then they just had it. So then in 2004, they just pulled it out of storage and they looked at it, right? So the police had it all that time. But okay, so why would he keep it? What's the theory here? Why would he keep this murder weapon?
Well, that was my thought, when I was sitting in the trial and watching the proceedings. I thought, why did he keep this letter opener in his desk in his apartment at Mercy Hospital? Why didn't he just take the letter opener and throw it off a bridge somewhere into the river or into, the lake? If that had happened, he would never have been charged because the letter opener was a key part of the investigation, linking it to the stab wounds and puncture marks in the altar cloth. But I talked to a couple people, including Dawn Perlmutter, who was an expert in ritual abuse and ritual killings. She advises police departments all over the world, really. And she told me that in a satanic ritual killing, she goes, first of all, they never do it with a gun. They never hang somebody. They always stab them. And that the killers believe that there's a power that transfers to the murder weapon, to the knife, in this case a letter opener. And so if the killer, they always keep that letter opener, they always keep the knife because they believe it gives them some kind of magical power, a black magical power. So that's the only reason that it makes any sense to me that Father Robinson would have kept that letter opener in his apartment, was because there was some kind of ritual involved and he believed it had some kind of power.
So sitting through the trial like you did, do you believe that it was a ritualistic killing, or he just snapped because they got in an argument and he just had a letter opener with them?
That's a really good question because, I've talked to the prosecutors about that because they brought in this Chicago priest who was an assistant to the exorcist in Chicago, in the Chicago diocese, to testify about all the signs that it was a ritual killing, a satanic mass, a black mass. And when they asked him, what kind of symbols are there that show you that this was a ritual killing, Father Grob said, well, where do we begin? And he said, there's just so many. And then after the trial was a couple days after Father Grob had testified, the prosecutors changed their tack and they decided not to pursue the ritual murder angle, and they just wanted to prove that the priest killed the nun. And in their closing arguments, they said he was just a priest who didn't like women, who was working for the nuns in the hospital, and he just snapped and killed her. So they told me the reason why they changed their tactics was because it might be too much for somebody to believe that a priest would, not only that a priest would kill a nun, but that he would kill her in a satanic ritual. So, so they decided to play it safe and just try and, just go with the idea that we'll just prove that he killed a nun and we'll just disregard, we won't get into the satanic ritual thing, which they had already brought up in trial, but they thought it was just kind of so far out that it might be hard to prove.
Yeah. So if this was a ritualistic killing, why would he do it on Holy Saturday?
The timing in rituals, the timing, the date and the time are always very important. And in this particular case, it happened on Holy Saturday, which is, on Good Friday in the Catholic Church. That's the day that Jesus, well, in all Christianity, that's the day that Jesus was crucified. Then he was buried and put in a tomb, and Holy Saturday is the day when Jesus was in the tomb, and then on Easter they celebrate the resurrection of Christ. So on Holy Saturday, the chalice, the Holy Eucharist is taken out of the chapel from where it normally is 364 days a year, and is placed into the sacristy, which is the room next to the chapel, because that's the day that Jesus was dead and in the tomb, and so it's a day of mourning. So the murder occurred in this room where the Holy Eucharist was present, and on the day that Jesus was in his tomb, and so the timing of that is just, it's a perfect setting for that kind of ritual killing.
That's interesting, and I did not know all that information. But, so sitting through this, you talked to some of the jurors, I talked to a juror, but what do you think they seized on finally that, yep, beyond a reasonable doubt, this is the guy?
Well, Father Robinson had contradicted himself about where he was at the time of the murder. First, he told the detectives that he was in his room at the hospital and had just gotten out of the shower when he got a phone call from the administrators, Sister Phyllis Ann Gerald, saying that Sister Margaret Ann had been killed. And so he said, I'll be right there. And he never did show up. And then another time he told somebody that he told another detective that he was getting dressed when he got the call into his cassock, which is the priest's long robe, and that he ran down to the chapel as soon as he heard that. So, he told conflicting stories about where he was, and then the prosecution brought in 3 eyewitnesses who had been working in a hospital in 1980, who said that they saw Father Robinson near the doors of the chapel on the day of the murder, shortly after the murder would have occurred. And so, one was a doctor, one was a EKG technician, and the other was just a hospital, like a worker there who, they all testified that they saw him near the murder scene around the time of the murder. So, you got the conflicting testimonies of Robinson's stories not making sense or not adding up. You got 3 people saying they saw him around the murder scene, and then you have the murder weapon being found in his apartment. So I think that those all were convincing.
So when you look back at this case, when you were putting the book together, and I'm sure you're probably logging stuff as you were going along, covering things, but when you got to review all these documents, I don't know, how long did you write the book after like the trial ended?
This is pretty amazing because I had never written a book before, and I being a journalist, you're used to deadlines, and they gave me a deadline of October 2006. Well, the trial was supposed to be like originally in 2005, and it kept getting pushed back and ended up being in April and May of 2006. So the trial was pushed back, a year, but they didn't change my deadline. And so I was really felt a real pressure to get that done. I asked for a leave of absence from the Blade, and they denied it. So I wrote it in 5 months. And it was pretty intense. I was working every weekend. I took as many days off as I could. It just was a very intense effort to get that book done in time. And then later I found out that, no authors turn in their books beyond the deadline, which I wish I had known.
So, I mean, as journalists, when we get these police files, prosecutor files, we always see more than a jury actually sees. So when you're digging through here, putting the book together, and looking through some of the reports, did your perspective change at all about what happened, or were you still pretty convinced that nope, they got it right?
Yeah, no, I do believe that Robinson was the killer. There were some interesting other things that came up, like John Donahue took over the case after the initial trial and filed the appeals, and he claimed that there was a murderer from Detroit who had killed up to 81 people, 81 women, and that he thinks he could have been in Toledo at the time of the murder. And but when police contacted him and asked this guy who was in prison if he was in Toledo the time of the murder, he said, "No, I never stepped foot in Toledo." So he was already convicted of being a serial killer. There seemed to be little reason for him to lie about it. So, but there was all these things that kept popping up, but I never did see anything that would persuade me otherwise.
Yeah. So Cora Watts, they ended up actually checking his DNA, and there was male DNA under her fingernails. I don't think the prosecution ever really answered whose DNA that was. So what do we think about that?
Well, first of all, when the murder occurred, DNA was not being used as evidence. Of course, now it's routine and crucial for most cases. But when they found some DNA under her fingernails, but the initial case, they clipped her fingernails. The coroner's office clipped the fingernails and put them in a bag, and then they later put it in some kind of solution that would melt it, and I'm not sure what the terminology is, but would provide DNA. It was not conclusive. It didn't really rule Robinson out, but it didn't prove that he was that, or Cora Watts, or any of those. It was just not enough to link it to anybody.
So do you think it was just a product of them not handling the evidence right in 1980 that created this male DNA under the fingernails, or is there really male DNA under her fingernails?
Well, the thing is, I don't know if they mishandled it, but they didn't look at DNA then as a key part of the evidence that needed to be preserved, because it had not been used in trials or cases. So they didn't protect the DNA like they probably should have and preserve it so that it was not ruined. But the other thing is, when the nun was first found on the floor of the sacristy, they put out a call, a Mr. Swift call through the hospital, which means, everybody has to rush, all the doctors and nurses should rush to the scene and try and help the victim. Well, they got there and, the nun was clearly dead and they couldn't do anything, but a lot of the doctors and nurses, technicians, they apparently touched her and, moved things around. And so, that they later said, the detective said, or the police officer, Dave Davidson, said they should have, sealed off the room. But on the other hand, they didn't know if she was dead and beyond help. And so it was natural for doctors to come in there and try and see if they could help her.
So I'm going to ask you two more questions, and the second to last one is, what unanswered questions remain in this story?
Well, one of the big questions is, was it a ritual killing or was it just a man who snapped and, took it out on a woman who he resented? That's a big thing because, if it was a ritual killing, it takes on a whole nother level of seriousness, or darkness than it would if it was just a killing of a priest who killed a nun because he was mad at her. So that's something I don't think we'll ever know. All the people involved are all passed away now. So, and Father Robinson never confessed to the murder, and he never denied it until after he was convicted. Then he signed an affidavit, said he did not kill Sister Margaret Ann Paul. But as Dean Mandros, the prosecutor, who's now a judge, said, that was a little too late, he should have said something during the trial instead of waiting until after the trial.
Did you ever talk to him after he was in prison?
Father Robinson? No, he would not talk to me.
Yeah. So the final question, so May is going to be 20 years since he was convicted. So 20 years ago, the circus came to town and this craziness. So looking back 20 years, what are your final thoughts on this case?
Well, this is a unique case. It's of tremendous interest. The only case that we know of where a priest was arrested and convicted of killing a nun, arrested by cold case detectives, that there was a cover-up by the Catholic Church to protect the priest in 1980 to keep him from being arrested. The fact that when he was arrested in 2004, that the whole atmosphere about priests in the Catholic Church had changed and made it more possible that a priest could be, put on trial for a murder, which would never have happened in 1980. So all those elements make this such a unique case and pretty compelling. And, even though I've covered it and done all this research, I still find it hard to believe. If I made this up as a fiction story, nobody would believe it,